Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to be seated fairly soon, I'd be pleased to welcome Professor Sarah Foote, who is the chair of the theology faculty here at the University of Oxford.
Hello and welcome on behalf of the theology faculty and the University of Oxford to this conference on persons and their brains. My name's Sarah Foote. I'm the Regius Professor of Ecclesiastical History and the chairman of the Theology Faculty Board, so effectively the head of department. The Ian Ramsey Centre is one of the most, perhaps the most active of the research centres that the theology faculty hosts, and Andrew Pinsent has been extremely energetic and working as its administrator in organising these conferences, and of course also in raising money for the support of research projects within the centre. And on behalf of the faculty and the Ian Ramsey Centre, I'd like to express our gratitude to the John Templeton Foundation, who provided some financial support towards this conference. I hope that at next year's conference, I'll be able to announce who the new Idrios Professor in Science and Religion is. I hope you've seen that we've advertised that vacancy with a closing date later this month, and we hope to make an appointment later this year. During the period that the Idrios chair has been vacant, Johannes Sakuba, a reader in theology, has been the acting director of the Ian Ramsey Centre, and it's to his credit also that this conference is going ahead with such a stupendous lineup of speakers. I regret very much that other commitments prevent me from participating in the conference with you, but I've seen the programme and I can see that it's going to be a fascinating set of discussions you're going to have, and I hope you confer very profitably, not just in these plenary sessions, but in the breakout sessions and during the social time that you have together. So have a wonderful conference.
My name is Andrew Pinsent, and on behalf of the management committee for this conference, and also our advisors, Professors Roger Scruton and Raymond Tallis, I would like to open the 2012 Ian Ramsey Centre Conference, Persons and Their Brains, hosted at St Anne's College, University of Oxford. I'd like to begin by making a few brief remarks about the historical context and the rationale for this conference. Some might be curious why the theology faculty of Oxford University will be particularly interested in the study of persons and their brains. But the answer is very simple. Theology takes what you might call a maternal interest in the notion of a person, because the development of theology first gave birth to the notion of a person. Persons and theology developed symbiotically in the history of Western thought, mainly because early Christians encountered a philosophical problem. The context of the revelations they believed they had received, particularly about the Trinity and the Incarnation, could not be articulated consistently with the tools of Greek philosophy alone. Notions like substance and accident were insufficient. Hence, a new principle was adopted and adapted, hypostasis in Greek, persona in Latin. Very soon, all human beings of all social classes were being considered as persons, capable of divine adoption through baptism, and hence acquiring superior connotations of dignity in comparison to mere matter in motion, a citizen of a state, or even rational animals. This unfolding development had many cultural and legal implications. In the Middle Ages, for example, the notion of a person was extended by early lawyers to the idea of a corporate personality. We're here in Oxford University as one of the first beneficiaries of the notion of corporate personality, and it has enjoyed centuries of fruitful existence as a kind of corporate person. In recent centuries, the term person has been slightly marginalized in favor of words like individual, and what the term denotes has sometimes been absorbed into collective nouns like the people. More recently, neuroscience has seemed to some to introduce certain challenges to what is commonly attributed to persons. For example, how are persons and brains related? In the light of neuroscience, are so-called folk psychological notions, such as self-identity, free will, consciousness, to be revised in a physically reductionistic manner? As a consequence, neuroscience has sometimes been perceived as a new cultural battlefield, framed in terms of science versus the humanities. What is perhaps less appreciated, however, are the ways in which neuroscience may offer the hope of enriching human self-understanding. For example, the study of the diverse cognitive functions of different parts of the brain may offer the hope of putting ancient philosophical insights into the diversity of human cognition on an empirical basis. Similarly, the interpersonal and specifically second-personal aspects of brain function now studied in social neuroscience may offer new inspirations to philosophers of persons, impacting in turn on theology and other disciplines of the humanities. At this conference, we are fortunate in having extremely distinguished plenary speakers and nearly 50 short papers to address these and other issues. We are looking forward to robust but courteous discussions and hope that the ideas stimulated by this exchange will bear fruit long after this conference is concluded. I'd like to now introduce you to Dr. Michael Parsons, who will go over some practical matters over the next few days. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. If you have questions about the academic programme, refer them to Andrew. If it's about anything else, I should be able to help. And you've probably noticed there's a colour code on the badges. If anybody's got a green spot on their badge, they ought to be able to help with a question. Ought is the important word. I do, I'm afraid, need to encourage you, always keep your door locked of your room. Unfortunately, there are enough people around in Oxford who know that during the summertime there are a lot of visitors who may be carrying a lot of loose cash and other valuables, and will try to relieve you of them. So please keep your doors locked and only let people in through the access codes if they're wearing a badge or you're otherwise convinced that they should be there. If you have a green or a yellow spot on your badge, it means you have paid for accommodation and you are going to get your evening meal as well, which will be dinner at 6:30. If you have a red one, it means that you will have lunch, but no dinner. It means you are not resident, but you will have lunch, you will get coffee and tea, but not dinner in the evening, just so everybody knows who is who. If you think you've got the wrong colour badge, could you see me or see Sarah, who's at the desk outside, and we'll see what we can do about it. Dinner will be in the dining hall, which you will have passed on the way in. I'm sorry about the great expanse of mud out there. They're relaying flagstones. There used to be a large temporary kitchen there, and the new building that's adjacent to the Woodsart Road is their brand new kitchen. They were going to have it all laid perfectly, but the rain interfered with all of that, I'm afraid. So we have to walk round, and it is signposted, and our tables will have Ian Ramsey Centre on them, and it's for dinner, it's family service, so when a table load is sat down, your food will be served to you. The people at one end will find that they're distributing the food for everybody. You may choose where you sit with that in mind. There will be a cash bar as well, and a bottle of wine can be purchased maybe individually or via a cooperative group to have with your meal. Lunch is a much lighter affair, and it will be in the marquee on the lawn. I have to say marquee in English because Americans have an entirely different understanding of the word marquee, which is the sign above a theatre or the like. This is a tent, and it's where you'll have your lunch. It's also where the reception will be at 6 o'clock this evening, and that's open to everybody. It doesn't matter what colour spot you've got on your badge. As long as you've got a badge, you'll get a drink and you'll get some nibbles at the reception before dinner. It said reception in the foyer, they've just changed it. Coffee and tea during the day will be in the foyer of this lecture theatre outside here, all the plenary sessions will be in this lecture theatre, which is known as the Mary Ogilvie Theatre, whereas the short paper seminars, one track will be in here, and the other two will be in seminar rooms at the bottom of the Ruth Deach building. A number of you are living in there anyway, but it's as you come in from the road, it's the building on your left-hand side. And when we come to the end of the day, the college bar will be open, but also so will the Royal Oak, which is just about 50 yards down the road that way. And you can take your choice, but I certainly have an inbuilt direction finding beer to the left. I think that's, have I missed anything, Andrew? I think I've covered nearly all of that. Okay, thank you.
We actually have a few minutes before we're due to start our first plenary at 4:30. So I might suggest you might just stretch your legs a bit. We wanted to start early in order to make sure that that we're ready to go with the main plenary sessions at 4:30. We'll just have a brief 10-minute breather now or so, and be ready back here about 25 past or so, ready to start promptly at 4:30. Thank you.
were assembled, actually, because I wonder whether it was a mistake of yours to let them go again.
Well, I wouldn't have let them go.
I know.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, would you mind gathering as soon as possible? So we're ready to start at 4:30. Thank you.
Do you have a PowerPoint presentation on that at the moment?
No, I'm just chairing this.
Oh, you're sharing. Oh, right.
I don't know whether the others...
I'll find out.
Yeah, Ray?
Have a look.
You just minimised.
There it is.
It's there. It is there, yes. It's a question of whether it's...
That's for Raymond Tallis.
Is he on now?
He's on next. After. Yes.
Okay, right, well,
Let's put it on now. That's it. Good.
okay. Well, I'll turn the microphones.
Okay, you're sure to say now, up to an hour of speaking. Raymond Tallis, Secretary General.
Well, presumably, the chair has got to...
That's right.
And they've been
Up to an hour speaker. And also about the microphone. But also tell people if they don't want to be recorded, just say so. Maybe make it, just push the microphone away or something.
Now, well, there's no camera on.
I don't know how to do that.
Okay, right, yeah. Okay, right. I think most people are in, right. While you take your seats, you've probably observed the fact that actually we are having a video record made of this, and it's actually being streamed live at the moment. When we come to the end of the main plenary sessions, and that'll be about an hour, there's an opportunity for questions. Now, it'd be quite important that actually you use a roving microphone, and we have an able slave who's going to be running up and down the aisle carrying it. So expect to have a microphone passed to you. That means that we can all hear the question, but also those who are watching and watching later will be able to hear it. If for some reason you don't want to appear live, like your agent doesn't know you're here or something, just sort of wave him away, and the camera actually won't bother to pick you up at that point either. But there will be a microphone. And similarly, if anybody is hard of hearing, of course is wearing a hearing aid, if you turn it to the T setting, there is an inductive loop, and you should be able to get better reception that way as well. Thank you. Over to you. Right.
Thank you very much. My name's Roger Scruton. I'm with Raymond Tallis, one of the co-organizer of this conference, at least of the intellectual content of it, and I'm very grateful to the Ian Ramsey Centre and to Andrew Pinson for enabling it. We're hoping over the course of the next 3 days to explore some of the questions which arise both for philosophers and for neuroscientists and psychologists concerning the precise way in which discoveries about the brain and about the nervous system can influence our understanding of people, and vice versa. To what extent does our prior understanding of people direct the kind of research that neuroscience should be undertaking? I'm just chairing this session, the first session. The speakers are Raymond Tallis, who is well known to all of you, I'm sure, a person of many talents. He's a philosopher, poet, novelist, and cultural critic, and was until recently, a physician and clinical scientist working on brain disorders, and has written very many books. The latest and most significant from our point of view has the neutral title of Aping Mankind, Neuromania, Darwinitis, and the Misrepresentation of Humanity, which is a perfectly objective attempt to understand where neuroscience now stands in the intellectual tradition. Peter Hacker is equally well known, a very distinguished philosopher, now emeritus research fellow at St John's here in Oxford, who has written widely on these issues and is perhaps one of the world's greatest experts on the philosophy of Wittgenstein. He has written a book which really does have a neutral title, together with Max Bennett, called Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience. But don't be deceived. It is a vicious polemic which has caused Peter to suffer greatly in the academic community for no good reason. Anyway, these two are now going to introduce our topic, and I hope that there will be time afterwards for discussion from the audience, which I will chair.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Roger, and thank you also, Andrew. It's to Roger I owe the first philosophical meeting I ever went to, which was 2 or 3 years ago, and this is my first philosophical conference, so I've lost my virginity twice, courtesy of Roger, so thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Andrew, also for involving me. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The question is, are persons brains? The short answer is no, but I suspect I owe you something slightly longer than that. And in this inevitably superficial talk, I want to set out some of the reasons why it's wrong to regard people as being identical with their brains, and it's a wincing mistake to talk about brains when we should be talking about people. I'm going to deal with nothing thoroughly in my half hour, and indeed my talk is to some extent a scoping exercise, defining some of the things I very much hope will be addressed in the days to come. First, I'm going to list some of the ways in which persons are identified with their brains. Then I'm going to suggest why so many people are inclined to do this. Indeed, they actually see it as plain common sense, validated by neuroscience. After these preliminaries, I'm going to set out some reasons for denying that persons are brains or their brains. This will occupy most of my talk. And finally, I'm going to say something about the challenges that have to be met if we establish that brains and persons are not identical. Where do we go from here? Now, there are many ways of identifying brains with persons, such that personal identity is brain identity and personal history is brain history. For some people, persons are all of their brains. For others, persons are part of their brains. Yet others say that persons are software implemented in the hardware of the brain, and to use the current buzz phrase, persons are connectomes, how their brains are wired up. Now, of course, the notion that the person is identical with all of the brain was proposed by Hippocrates 2,500 years ago, and it was still pretty old news then, because some of the pre-Socratics suggested this as well. As he said in his treatise on epilepsy, men ought to know that from the brain and from the brain only arise our pleasures, joys, laughter and jests, as well as our sorrows, pain, grief and tears. Through it, in particular, we think, see, hear, and distinguish the ugly from the beautiful, the bad from the good, the pleasant from the unpleasant. And this sounds amazingly similar to something that Francis Crick said a couple of decades ago. Your joys and sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Although Crick, in common with many others, thought that the person was located in a bit of the brain, not the whole of it, his favourite spot was the claustrum, deep in the hemispheres where many pathways converge. These then are some of the ways personhood is construed as being identical with the brain or activity in it. But why are we inclined to believe that we shall find personhood in the brain? There are reasons rooted in everyday observations and reasons that seem to take their rise from neuroscience. First, some homely observations. Most obviously, the hair of the eye is located where the brain is. The brain, or the head that contains it, is seen to define the center of egocentric space. Insofar as that space has coordinates, the brain appears to lie at the point of origin, or the head. If my brain is in a particular room in Oxford, so am I. My history and the spatio-temporal trajectory of my brain are somehow inseparable. And then there are the effects of brain damage. Severe brain damage may lead to loss of consciousness and loss of personhood. Less severe brain damage causes impairment or alteration of consciousness and change in personality. Chop my head off and my IQ falls. Now, these homely observations have been supplemented by a huge body of knowledge about the impact of injury to or dysfunction of different parts of the brain on every aspect of behavior and awareness. Recordings made from the brains of living subjects using technologies such as electroencephalography and various kinds of brain scans, such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, have demonstrated extraordinary correlations of neural activity with levels of consciousness: alert, drowsy, asleep, comatose, your history as you're listening to me, with the contents of consciousness. And there's been associations, also close correlations, between the contents of consciousness, such as perception, memory, emotion, and thought. Less closely, but still impressively, correlations with neural activity with the propensity to behave in a certain way. So it seems reasonable to conclude from this that every aspect of the consciousness of a person, from the most primitive sensation to the most exquisitely constructed sense of self, depends, in some sense, on or is caught up with brain function. So we may conclude from this that to live a normal life as a person requires a brain in good working order. But are we justified in concluding from this that to live a normal life as a person is to be a brain in some kind of working order? Are we justified in concluding that the brain is not only a necessary, but also a sufficient condition of personhood, that persons and brains are the same? Now, in order to answer this question, I'll look at certain aspects of personhood and see whether they could be identical with what goes on in the brain. The aspect I want to spend most time on is consciousness, the sine qua non of personhood, as that in virtue of which there are phenomenal appearances, and which, from perception upwards, has intentionality. I want to look at first-person being that underpins having a viewpoint, briefly at the unity of consciousness at any particular time, and the temporal depth of consciousness, the sense of I extended over time. A fifth aspect of personhood is agency, which I'm going to set aside until I discuss it with Rita Carter tomorrow. So, consciousness. Is brain activity sufficient rather than merely necessary for consciousness, so we can identify the one with the other? Now, before I deal with the arguments, I want to set aside or to fillet an empirical red herring. It's possible, by direct brain stimulation, to cause individuals to have quite complex experiences. The most famous example is the work of the neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield, who stimulated certain areas in the cerebral cortex of waking subjects. When these areas were stimulated, the subjects would not only have simple sensations, but often quite complex experiences, corresponding sometimes to previously dormant memories of past events. This would seem to suggest to some that experiences could be generated in the standalone brain, and that, as suggested in the brain in the vat thought experiment, the entire consciousness of a person could be created or constructed by simulation of the neural inputs of a brain sustained in a vat of nutrient. The conclusion is invalid. First, Penfield subjects were already awake. In other words, the background wakefulness required for the experiences to be had and interpreted was provided independently of the stimulation. Secondly, the experiences would not have counted as memories of the subject's past, except in relation to a life prior to the moment of stimulation, in which experiences have been had in the usual way, and then subsequently qualified as memories. So much for the red herring. Now to the arguments. Now, before I consider whether key features of personhood could be plausibly located in brain activity, I want to rephrase the question slightly. The brain is a piece of matter. Could a piece of matter have the consciousness that is necessary to be a person? If not, the brain couldn't be a person. And by a piece of matter, I mean a piece of something whose definitive description or most authoritative portrait is to be found in the physical sciences. Now, this has been part of the neuroscientist's creed for a long time, as witness this quote from a leading 19th century biologist and one of the founders of neurophysiology, Émile Raymond. Brooker, who was his colleague, and I pledged a solemn oath to put into power this truth: no other forces than the common physical-chemical ones are active within the organism, hence within the brain. And more recently, this has been spelt out by Daniel Dennett. There's only one sort of stuff, namely matter, the physical stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology, and the mind is somehow nothing but a physical phenomenon. In short, the mind is the brain. We can, in principle, account for every mental phenomenon, and I've underlined this bit that follows, using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials that suffice to explain radioactivity, continental drift, photosynthesis, reproduction, nutrition, and growth. Dennett's formulation, which he says is current orthodoxy, should block off the ploy of mobilizing certain terms of rhetoric that are often put into play when materialists are challenged to explain the difference between unconscious matter and conscious people, terms such as emergence, supervenience, and complexity, since the net says that the same physical principles are conserved when we move from rocks to bacteria to professors of philosophy. And I'm going to touch on these terms brief at the end, and I hope we'll examine them critically in the next few days. And so to consciousness, and to two aspects of consciousness, intentionality and appearance, that I want to focus on. Now, the case for the identity of phenomenal consciousness and neural activity does seem to have been based on a slither. The slither is as follows. From rough correlation of activity in certain parts of the brain and conscious experience, to the belief that the brain activity causes or generates the conscious experience, and thence to the further belief that the brain activity is the conscious experience. Now, this slither has been challenged from Victorian times onwards. Here, for example, is the view of Alfred Wallace. The passage from the physics of the brain to the corresponding facts of consciousness is unthinkable. Were our minds and senses so expanded, strengthened, and illuminated as to enable us to see and feel the very molecules of the brain, were we capable of following all their motions, we shall be as far as ever from the solution of the problem: how are these physical processes connected with the facts of consciousness? The chasm between the two classes of phenomena would still remain intellectually impassable. And of course, his view has been echoed more recently by the so-called Mysterians, people like Colin McGinn. And of course, the reply of the neurophilosophers has usually been, it's a brute fact, get over it. So the question we need to ask is, can you be a sincere or consistent materialist and still believe that conscious persons are brain activity? So you could build a person out of neural activity using the same physical principles, laws, and raw materials that suffice to explain radioactivity, continental drift, and so on. If we conclude that we cannot in principle, then we need to abandon the person-brain identity theory. Now, in addressing this, I'm going to go over some very well-trodden territory, in full awareness of Austin's observation that one has to be a special kind of fool to rush in where so many angels have trodden already. But I want to take a slightly different path through this well-trodden territory, as I focus on intentionality and phenomenal appearances. Let me touch on intentionality, taking a very simple example. The perception of a material object, such as the case of this person looking at a glass. She's an embodied subject looking at an object that she appreciates as being other than herself. Now, the laws of nature, as evident in the material world, seem to be in ordinary operation as we follow the causal chain that links the events in the glass, the interference between the light and the glass, and the events in the retina and visual pathways terminating in the visual cortex. This is indicated by the upper arrow. This causal sequence is not, of course, awareness of the glass. The latter is indicated by the lower arrow, which is not reverse causation or feedback or reaching for the glass, but it is something quite different. So the causal chain, the processes and laws by which light gets into and passes down the visual pathways, do not encompass the gaze looking out. So there's something going on here that is at odds with the laws of material nature as they apply to the things that Dennett listed. Intentionality is, to use Herbert Feigel's phrase of 50 years ago, a nomological dangler, which, as he argued, doesn't fit into the world picture of physical science. We can highlight this oddness in a different way. Firstly, intentionality reaches, as it were, causally upstream. If the perception of the glass were identical with activity in the visual cortex, that activity would be mysteriously reaching back to its own causal antecedents. Interestingly, reaching past some antecedents, for example, activity in the retina, and stopping short of others, everything from the Big Bang onwards that led up to the light interacting at that moment with the glass. Secondly, the objects of our perception exceed that which is revealed to our senses. Perception goes beyond sentience. Object perception is the most basic example of the fact that, as Barry Stroud has said, our objects of knowledge are underdetermined by whatever it is we get through the sources of knowledge known as the senses or experience. This is a level at which experience has reference beyond itself. In summary, the law-governed causal pathways seen in the material world do not capture what happens when a person is aware of a glass, never mind when she's aware of another person being aware of her, or aware of the pressure to conform to an abstract social norm. And this has prompted some desperate suggestions to get rid of intentionality and to deny that consciousness or neural activity is about anything distinct from itself. These include the assertion that consciousness, or in some cases the mind, is the brain's experience of itself, or that consciousness is our perception of some physical processes in the brain. In short, that consciousness and the appearance of that which seems to appear to us are made of the appearance of nerve impulses to themselves. This notion of the world as an idea cooked up by neurons, which telescopes that which is to that which is to be perceived, and that in virtue of which it is perceived, this view of neural activity, mysteriously aware of itself, and transforming that awareness into an awareness of a world that causes it, is possibly the unhappiest marriage of materialism and idealism that one could imagine. And this is acknowledged by one or two writers. For example, the philosopher of biology, Alex Rosenberg, in his latest book. Mind, he argues, is identical with brain. A thought must be an event in the brain. No neural activity can be about anything inside or outside of the brain or the mind. No thought, therefore, is about anything. What can one say but speak for yourself, mate? Now on to appearances. Conscious beings, such as persons, are entities in virtue of which items such as material objects have appearances to a viewpoint. Now, do material objects in themselves have appearances, corresponding to or forming the basic contents of consciousness? Now we can approach this in a couple of ways. The first is to note that the concept of matter, or the basic stuff of the world as seen through the eyes of physics, is alien to appearances. The second is that the notion of material objects having an appearance in themselves, independent of any viewpoint, is self-contradictory. Let me focus on the idea that material objects have appearances in themselves, the false idea. As materialist accounts of the world's advance towards their own idea of completeness, there is a gradual disappearance of appearance. An aspect of this is the way matter is ultimately seen as purely quantitative rather than qualitative. Let me illustrate the connection between the progress towards a quantitative account of things and the marginalization of appearances with a very simple example. Consider an object such as a table. As I experience it, it may seem large or small, light brown or dark brown, heavy or light. As seen through the lens of a mature physical science, even if we don't drill down to the atomic level, the table boils down to certain quantities. It's 2 foot by 2 foot. It has such and such a weight in grams. The light reflected from it has a certain mixture of wavelengths. This approach to the table, which bypasses those things that are peculiar to my view or yours, as it becomes progressively more objective and a more appropriate substrate for a law-based understanding, gradually elutes phenomenal appearances, those things that constitute the world of which we are conscious. The latter, the phenomenal appearances, are dismissed as being ontologically suspect, as mere, say, secondary qualities. The warmth of heat, the opposition of inertia, the brightness of light are all stripped off. In short, there is progressive disappearance of phenomenal appearance, of that which fills, or take your pick, constitutes basic consciousness. In short, the world, according to physics, and the kind of laws that treats earthquakes and photosynthesis equally, should treat neural activity likewise, is a world in which appearance has been made willfully to disappear. A qualitative appearance cannot be equated to a set of events that are ultimately described quantitatively, though this is what neurophilosophers such as Paul Churchland believe, as when he asserts that, for example, conscious experiences are the values of n variables in an n-dimensional activation vector space. Now, another way of looking at this is to see that physical science has as its asymptote the most general laws that represent the sum total of things, and hence things viewed from no particular perspective. As we move towards laws, we move away from viewpoint. The equations linking patterns of measured change are delocalized. They offer not so much a view from nowhere as a view without a viewpoint. Now, this is another aspect of the fact that the laws of physics are laws of a world in which appearance has disappeared. Now, although the relationship between measurement and experience is complex, measurement rejects the experiences associated with the process of measurement. All that remains is the number that pops out of the measuring process, a number whose phenomenal appearance, in terms of its tokens, is irrelevant. Now, you might think that this argument is based on an elementary confusion between how things are represented and what they are in themselves, or between epistemic and constitutive aspects of matter. But this distinction doesn't alter the fact that the abolition of viewpoint that generates the notion of matter as something in itself, independent of consciousness, removes appearances. We could approach this another way. This blank slide shows how a rock or a mountain or the world would appear from no particular viewpoint. An item such as a rock cannot have an appearance that is neither from the front or the back, from above or below, from within or without, from near or far, in good light or poor light. So a sincere materialist cannot look to a material object such as the brain to be the basis of phenomenal consciousness. Things are no better if we focus on neural activity. They do not have an appearance in themselves, and there is nothing within them to make other items appear, for them to be that in virtue of which appearance is possible. And this is connected with one of the many intractable problems facing those who wish to neuralize consciousness. Very little of the activity in the central nervous system is actually associated with consciousness. From this we can infer that there is nothing in nerve impulses per se that would make them conscious of themselves or of a world. So the hunt is on to identify those additional characteristics that neural activity would have to have in order to transform it from the mere background to, or condition of consciousness, into consciousness itself. Location in a particular part of the brain, or in several parts of the brain linked together in an ensemble, the assumption of certain patterns of activity, none of these offer any plausible explanation of how biophysical events should take on an entirely different character. We know that travel broadens the mind, but it is not clear why travel to a particular place in the brain would broaden neural activity into a mind. This is, of course, connected with the unavailability of intentionality in the material world. Human perception, which locates items out there with respect to me here, locates me at the center of things, because the lines of intentionality have a genuine origin or vanishing point at a me located in my body. As a first-person being, I face or confront a world rather than merely being causally wired into it like a stone or a bacterium or any unconscious bit of living matter. Now, first-person being poses another problem for the neuralizers of consciousness, even if we shrivel the person in question to mere self moments. It's this: the many experiences that we have at any one time, sights, sounds, smells, other sensations, memories, thoughts, and emotions, are in some sense unified, having a subject unity where they are experienced as belonging to the self at the same time. They belong to a sense of me here now. The different contents of consciousness are supposed to be kept apart by existing in different parts of the brain. Yet they're also required to come together. And however this convergence is envisaged as being accomplished neurophysiologically, those contents would always seem, in the very act of becoming unified, to lose their distinction, becoming boiled down to some unholy soup of undifferentiated awareness. One of the most striking mysteries of the field of consciousness, of the momentary self, is that it is unified while still retaining the distinctiveness of its contents. This is the so-called binding problem, and there have been many attempts to find a solution to it. These attempts mostly depend on the idea that certain physical properties, common to large swathes of the brain, can bring together activity scattered across different regions. All of the different regions will be activated at once, making the moment of consciousness a moment, but without losing their spatial separateness. Proposed candidates for the special properties have included electromagnetic fields, quantum coherence, and synchronous electrical oscillations in large sections of the cerebral cortex. But all of these candidates fail for the simple reason that they rely on objective or externally observed unity being translated into subjective or immediately experienced unity, with no reason offered for why this should happen. The appeal to synchronous activity to explain how the moment of consciousness is unified is particularly revealing because it illustrates how insincere materialism is. Insincere materialists ascribe to matter properties that are borrowed from mind. The assumption that neural activity can be intrinsically synchronous locates simultaneity in the material world. something that physicists post-Einstein do not allow. Simultaneity is observer-dependent. And this insincerity is also evident in the attempts to make neural sense of the temporal depth of the person, of the fact that we are aware of things that are explicitly past, and we anticipate things that are explicitly future. Let's just focus on the past. The standard story of memory is that it is, to use Henri Bergson's sardonic phrase, a cerebral deposit. It's most commonly understood as the effect that past events have had on the excitability of parts of the brain, mediated by, for example, changes in synapses. And memory is a reactivated circuit that is prone to be reactivated because it's been excited in the past. Why is this standard story nonsense? There are numerous reasons, but time constraints dictate that I focus on just two. The first is that this account requires the present state of the brain, a material object, I will remind you, to reach up to causes of its present state, and B, to locate those causes at a temporal distance from the present. Explicit episodic memories are explicitly of something not present, something explicitly past. So memory requires double intentionality, two layers of aboutness. A memory is about an experience that is about that which it was an experience of. As discussed already, intentionality is not a property of the material world, and this applies even more clearly to double intentionality. Of course, tensed time, the past, the present, and the future, do not exist in the material world. For this, I have no lesser authority than Herr Professor Einstein. Physicists, he said, know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. This is in a famous, though rather tactless letter to the recently widowed wife of his oldest friend. But there are no tenses without a conscious viewpoint to establish a now. There are other characteristics of the person that can't be captured by an account that sees the person as the property of a material object, even a material object as upmarket as the brain. I've mentioned ownership. Our experiences are our experiences in a rather complex sense of possession that needs much teasing out. And we talk about our brains. The brain is no one's brain. And then there's agency, which we'll be discussing tomorrow. But I want to move on to the question of why, if brainhood and personhood are so obviously distinct, the notion that we are our brains should have commanded so much attention. There are 4 reasons or strategies mobilized in persuading us that the obviously untrue is true. These are the strategies: thinking by transferred epithet, hopeful hand-waving, denying the reality of what neuroscience cannot see, and arguing there is no alternative. Thinking by transferred epithet results in personifying the brain in order to brainify the person. This includes ascribing to brains or parts of brains attributes appropriately ascribed to persons, and much fancy footwork between brains, machines, and conscious minds. I'm going to say very little about this because it's been dealt with brilliantly and definitively by Peter Hacker in his writings. The next consists of hand-waving, using terms which promise much, even when they are not examined closely, but much less when we ask for clarity. Terence Deacon's recent 500-page book on how mind emerged from matter via living matter and other thermodynamic systems, which I had the much alloyed pleasure of reviewing, is a perfect example of this. Yes, squids have different properties from crystals, but this doesn't demonstrate that the difference between unconscious crystals and conscious human beings can be explained by emergence on the basis of increased complexity. Any appeal to complexity should be challenged on 2 fronts: what is meant by complexity and how it is measured or diagnosed, and why it should deliver the difference between, say, a bacterium innocent of its own existence and a person with all the characteristics I've been talking about. The usual response to the challenge is ever more frantic hand-waving. Another strategy is to deny the existence of those things that cannot be accommodated in neuroscience. The self and the ego and agency have frequently been dismissed as ontologically rather shabby, and bolder or more desperate spirits have dismissed qualia and propositional attitudes such as beliefs as relics of a pre-scientific folk psychology. A not infrequent claim is that agency and the I and the self are cooked up in the brain, which opens up some interesting questions. Why should a piece of matter, a mere byway in the causal net, come to the false conclusion that it is somewhat superior to other pieces of matter, other byways in the causal net? And by what material means would another piece of matter make the mistake of becoming aware that it is what it is? Time to draw to a close. I'm conscious that the scope of my talk is such that I've touched on many things very superficially. In some ways, it sets out a wish list of those items that I'd like us to discuss in the next few days. In particular, I've glided over, or glided past, the different challenges that are presented by the sentience found widely in the animal kingdom and human consciousness, the different challenges these present to physicalism. Additionally, I'd be very interested to know whether intentionality can carry the weight that I, along with others, have placed on it. Does it resist biologization, as I believe, or is it, after all, a biological property, as many such as Searle have asserted? And to that wish list, I would like to add a couple more. I've focused on the troubles of neurophilosophy, but I'm aware that anti-neurophilosophy also has its own troubles. Those who believe that personhood boils down to brainhood are entitled to point to several serious questions that opponents like me leave unanswered. Why, if the brain is not the basis of consciousness, is it so intimately bound up with our awareness and our behavior? What are we to make of the genuine advances of neuroscience? Should we abandon brain science entirely as a source of understanding personhood? Where would the brain fit into a metaphysics, an epistemology, an ontology that denies the brain a place at their center? How should we deal with the fact that we are evolved organisms as well as persons? These are some of the questions that I think anti-neurophilosophers like me should be obliged to address, and I hope we shall address them either in this room or over a few beers in the next few days. Thank you.
Escape, shall we? Escape. It's being sicked. Right. Do we? It's being fixed at the back, is it?
All right. Wherever it's gone. That one.
Yes.
Which one? Come on.
Should I just escape?
Sorry about this.
That won't do anything to it, unfortunately.
Sorry.
Come on. Come on. I'll go and attack it from the back in a moment.
F5B.
So the whole thing's seized up.
F5.
No. That will blank you, right? Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. No, so that you can
Oh, leave it open.
Yes.
Right. Sorry, Peter.
Thank you very much, Roger and Ray, for inviting me to this splendid meeting. I think the issues we're going to discuss today and in the next few days are very pressing and of considerable importance in current cultural change and cultural development. My brief was to discuss the question, are persons' brains the challenge of Crypto-Cartesianism? We are human beings, members of the species Homo sapiens. Like all living things, we have the powers of ingestion, growth, and reproduction. Like all animals, we are sentient, self-moving, goal-directed creatures with desires and purposes of our own. Unlike plants, but like other developed forms of animal life, we have not only one-way powers, but also two-way powers to act and refrain from acting as we please. What differentiates us from the rest of the animal kingdom, and what makes us unique in nature, is that we have, as Aristotle put it, a rational psyche. that is, the power to reason and sensitivity to reasons. We can draw inferences from premises, and we can reason from evidence to conclusions. We have reasons for beliefs and for emotions. We act for reasons in pursuit of goals for which we have reasons. Such rational capacities make us the kinds of creatures we are. Rationality is a characteristic of language-using creatures. Only language users can reason their way from premises to what they imply and make inferences from evidence. Only language users can, with respect to what they think, feel, and plan to do, raise the question, why? And only language users can answer it. Throughout the ages, philosophers have reflected on what makes us unique in nature, and various characteristics have been correctly singled out, such as knowledge of truths of reason, and knowledge of good and evil, possession of a soul or mind, self-consciousness, that is, not in the thin sense of being able to say that you've got a headache or a pain in your knee. It is rather an ability to reflect on ourselves, on our experiences, on our motives for acting, on our likes and dislikes, our emotions and their rationale. And hence too we have a capacity for guilt and remorse. We have a sense of identity, which is a function of, as it were, our autobiography, and of our identification with the history, actual or fictitious, of our social group. And finally, mastery of techniques of production and consequent ability to invest in productive capital. No doubt one could add many more features, and many philosophers and political theorists have done so, such as a capacity to play games, as Hautzinger elaborated in his book Homo Ludens. We have a sense of beauty and a sense of humor and a capacity for happiness which no other animal has. What is striking about all the items mentioned is that they're not a haphazard collection of things that human beings can be, do, or have. They're not only very general and fundamental powers characteristic of us, they also possess a unity which was not, I think, recognized until the 20th century. For all the characteristic features that have been earmarked are dependent upon the mastery of a complex language and upon the cultural consequences of this remarkable skill. We are, above all, Homo loquens. Human nature is the result of grafting language onto animal nature. The concept of a human being is a substance concept. The concept of a person is not. It is a status concept in moral and legal discourse. A living substance qualifies for the status of a person if and only if it satisfies the requisite qualifications for being a person. That is, for being the bearer of rights and duties, for being responsible, that is, answerable for deeds, for being the object of the formal respect that is due to such beings. The species qualification for being a person are rationality and its corollary, autonomy, as well as sympathy and its corollary, love or friendship. Although Aristotle conceived of a human being as a unified single substance, the orphic Platonic tradition conceived of a human being as a combination of two distinct substances. This suited the Christian commitment to an afterlife and to the survival of the soul after death. This conception was fully elaborated by Augustine. Augustinian dualism was a primary inspiration for Cartesian metaphysics in the early modern era. Cartesian dualism is a three-legged stool. Its legs are, firstly, a philosophical vision of the mechanical nature of the universe. Everything other than the mind is to be explained in terms of geometrical properties of matter and of material corpuscles in motion. Hence, life, too, is to be explained in purely mechanical terms. So biology is reducible to physics. Secondly, the mind is an immaterial substance that interacts with the brain at the pineal gland, at which point it controls, by means of acts of will, the flow of animal spirits to the muscles, causing them to expand or contract. And thirdly, the mind is essentially characterized in terms of consciousness of its own contents. that is, of thoughts, or cogitationes, in Descartes' idiosyncratic sense of the term. Mental attributes are essentially privately owned and epistemically private. That is, no one can have the same experience as another, and no one can really know what the experiences of another are or are really like. So, human beings are combinations of mind and body. The body a person has is, crudely speaking, the vehicle for the mind or soul, which is what a person essentially is. Human persons are embodied minds. Persons are essentially immaterial mental substances. The body a person has is causally related to the mind or soul that a person is. The behavior of a human body is mere motion caused by the acts of will of the mind. The body does not perform acts of speech, but emits noises. The body doesn't act in the world, smiling, greeting, chatting, cashing checks, writing letters, running for the bus, playing games, making experiments. The body makes movements. What makes such movements into human actions is their causal generation by mental acts of will. Mental acts and activities, states and processes, attitudes and passions belong to the inner private life of man. Mere bodily movements belong to the outer observable life of man. The perceptual experiences of a human being are the effects of the impact of objects and radiation upon the nerve endings of the body. These, transmitted to the pineal gland, produce experiences in the inner citadel of the mind. So the mental is an attribute of the mind. It is the mind that is conscious or unconscious, that senses and perceives, that thinks and feels, forms intentions, makes decisions, and performs acts of will that cause the body to move. The connection between the inner and the outer is causal and non-logical. This conception is immensely powerful. It articulates in sophisticated form a fiction that grips the imagination of mankind. It has cast a long shadow over European thought for the last 4 centuries. Even when repudiated, the misconceptions to which it gave birth persist. For its repudiation has typically taken one or the other of 2 forms: idealism on the one hand and materialism or behaviourism on the other. Each of these retains one half of a pernicious Cartesian duality, together with all the misconceptions that go with it. What is most distinctive of the current intellectual and scientific scene is that despite its official materialism and its much vaunted anti-Cartesian stance, it is, conceptually speaking, Cartesian through and through. Much of contemporary cognitive neuroscience repudiates the idea of a Cartesian mind, conceived as an immaterial spiritual substance, and avers that the mind just is the brain. It then proceeds to ascribe the attributes characteristic of the Cartesian mind to the brain. It's noteworthy that it retains intact the Cartesian conception of the structural relationship between the mind and the body, transferring it without alteration to the relationship between the brain and the body. The 17th century representational theory of perception is still widely accepted by distinguished neuroscientists such as Ramachandran or Chris Frith in London. And the 17th century causal theory of volition is equally widely accepted, for example by Libet. So what is being advanced by present-day cognitive neuroscientists and self-styled cognitive scientists is very often a perverse form of brain-body dualism in place of mind-body dualism, replacing ethereal non-matter by 3 pounds of grey glutinous matter while leaving everything else intact. But this is to succumb to the worst of the Cartesian misconceptions, for the mere replacement of the mind by the brain is altogether superficial. One needs to be much more anti-Cartesian. The question marks have to be put much deeper down. It's tempting for the moderns to think that the human person is really the human brain. This conception has been enthusiastically embraced by philosophers and neuroscientists alike. Consciousness, John Searle informs us, I quote, is a feature or property of the brain in the sense, for example, that liquidity is a feature of water, unquote. Consciousness is, according to the Cartesian and Lockean conception, the general form of all operations of the mind. And if consciousness is a feature of the brain, then conscious states are presumably states of the brain. So all the psychological properties of which we are aware are in fact properties of our brain. So insofar as we are conscious creatures, we are our brains. We are not, of course, brains in a vat, but we are brains in a skull. Embodied brains, just as on the Cartesian conception, we are embodied minds. Distinguished neuroscientists, such as Francis Crick, follow a similar track. You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Consequently, it's not surprising to find Crick ascribing to the brain such attributes as thinking, believing, interpreting, guessing, combining information, making assumptions, and attending to visibilia. Colin Blakemore has suggested that the brain knows things, reasons inductively, constructs hypotheses. Damasio, Frith, and Libet hold that the brain makes decisions and initiates voluntary action. In short, a wide range of cognitive, cogitative, and volitional powers and their exercise, which the Cartesians ascribe to the mind, are currently being ascribed to the brain. Given that the Cartesian Lockean conception has dominated our thinking for the last 3.5 centuries, it has been much easier to make the transition from mind-body dualism to brain-body dualism, rather than to abandon altogether this way of conceiving ourselves, of our distinctive powers, and of our exercise of them. I shall show in a moment just why this way of thinking is conceptually incoherent. But before doing so, it's worth dwelling briefly on what makes the conception so tempting. First, the identification of the mind with the brain seems very attractive to those who rightly feel uncomfortable with the idea of an immaterial substance that lacks criteria of identity and that mysteriously, indeed unintelligibly, interacts with the body. In a gullible age such as ours, when scientism dominates the public arena, partly due to journalism and partly due to governmental interference in academia, the brain seems the best candidate to play the role of the locus of the cognitive, cogitative, affective, and volitional activities. So if the mind is not a mysterious immaterial substance, then, many scientists suppose, it must be the brain. What else could it be? Secondly, we live in an age of electronic technology that's transforming the world. We've always been prone to try to render ourselves intelligible to ourselves in terms of our latest technology. When I was a boy, the favored analogy for the relation of mind, brain, and body was the telephone system. The mind being the telephone exchange operator, the brain being the exchange, and the body the telephones. Now the favored analogy is the computer. The mind being the software, the brain the hardware, and the body the computer output displayed on the screen. So the brain is commonly conceived to be a biological machine, an information processor that carries out cognitive operations in all their variety. This modern analogy is no deeper than the older one. Taking it seriously leads to such intellectual aberrations as computational psychology, which masquerades as cognitive psychology. Neither human beings nor their brains are information processors. Brains are not computers, and the mind is not a computer program. Thirdly, the unwarranted excitement and credulity about functional magnetic resonance imaging and its apparent results fosters the thought that we can actually see the brain thinking, perceiving, feeling emotions, and making decisions. For do we not observe fMRI scanners that produce colored pictures of the brain's mental activities? This encourages the idea that mental attributes are actually identical with neural states, events, and processes, and seems to confirm the thought that the brain is the mind. It should not be necessary in this audience to remark not only that the promise exceeds the performance, but also that the promise should never have been made. Skeptics have remarked, rather nastily, that the current exaggerated interest is reminiscent of the 19th century excitement at phrenology, which in its heyday had 23 scientific journals to spread its discoveries, some dozen of which were peer-reviewed. Now, it's certainly not for a philosopher to challenge the techniques employed by neuroscientists. But even philosophers ought to be aware of the fact that it's far from clear what exactly, apart from glucose consumption, is being measured by fMRI. Is it excitation or inhibition, or both? It is anything but clear what the relationship is between the fMRI bold signal and the 94% of energy consumption in the brain that is not measured by fMRI and which has no stable baseline. It's recently been shown that the apparently precise localization determined by the usual 6 test runs of fMRI signals from a patient in an experiment vanishes if one does 100 test runs and averages them. For then the psychological activity can be correlated with fMRI signals from all over the cortex. Eminent scientists, including Ogawa, the inventor of the fMRI technique, have expressed grave doubts about its current use. It may well be that the 30,000 papers reporting fMRI results turn out to be the illusion of the epoch. That's an empirical conjecture. I have no particular right to make it, but at any rate one ought to be aware that these results are still up for question. Fourthly, just as Locke was impressed by the fiction of the cobbler waking up in the body of a prince, so too philosophers are impressed by the science fiction of brain transplants. It is amusing to recall that Jonathan Swift entertained a similar conceit in Gulliver's Travels, in the voyage to Balnibarbi. But what he held to be a joke, current philosophers hold to be a material possibility that sheds light on what a person is and on what the criteria of identity for a person are. This isn't science fiction, philosophers remonstrate. It's a thought experiment. And thinking thus, they conceive of the brain as a limiting case of a mutilated human being. Hence they conclude, you are your brain, just as philosophers used to conclude, you are your mind. Both conclusions are misconceived. Rather than being swept along by the tide, we should pause and go back to the beginning of conceptual enlightenment, which is clarification of what exactly is meant by the terms we use and abuse with such enthusiasm. The mind is not an anything, but to have a mind is to possess and exercise a range of intellectual and volitional abilities. If we examine the English idioms concerning the mind, 2 features are prominent. First, the idioms cluster primarily around 4 foci: thought, opinion, memory, and will. Secondly, all these idioms are paraphrasable without using the word mind at all. So, for example, for a thought to cross one's mind is for something to occur to one. To turn one's mind to something is to begin to think about it. To have something on one's mind is to preoccupy it with something. Similarly, to know one's mind is to have formed an opinion, and to be of one mind with another is to share the same opinion. Hence, too, to call something to mind is to recollect it, and for something to slip from one's mind is to forget it. To make up one's mind is to decide, to change one's mind is to revoke one's decision, and to be in 2 minds is to be undecided. To cut a long story short, we can draw 4 important conclusions from this. First, all talk of the mind is a convenient façon de parler for talk of human faculties amenable to reason and for the description of their exercise. To have a mind is not to possess anything, nor is it intelligible to suppose that one is what one has. Anima mea non est ego, as Aquinas sapiently observed. Rather, to have a mind is to be able to do a wide variety of things, in particular things that are sensitive to reason, to reasons and reasoning, and that are rooted in mastery of a language. Secondly, the mind is no more an entity of any kind than is the horsepower of a car. To ask for the locus of the mind is akin to asking for the locus of the horsepower of the car. The mind is no more literally in the head than love is literally in the heart. Thirdly, it should by now be obvious why it's mistaken to attribute mental attributes to the mind, for it makes no sense to ascribe thought, perception, feeling, or volition to a set of abilities. It's not my mind that thinks that things are so, it is I. It's not my mind that sees my hand, I see it. It's not my mind that listens to music, I do. And it isn't my mind that decides to do something, I decide. In short, one cannot intelligibly ascribe the attributes of a cognitive, cogitative, and volitional agent to the mind. Insofar as we speak of doing anything with or of using our mind, this is to be understood as akin to doing things with and using our talents. It is to exercise our abilities of intellect and will. Fourthly, to suppose that one's mind is identical with one's brain is a category mistake. A set of complex abilities and their exercise cannot intelligibly be said to be identical with an object or organ or the neural processes going on within it. Fifthly, to suppose that the human person is the mind, that I am my mind, is incoherent, for I can't be identical with something that I have. Moreover, a set of intellectual and volitional powers is not a substance of any kind, but must belong to some substance or other. Nor is such a set of powers an agent of any kind, but these powers must be exercised by some agent or other. That substance, that agent, is the human being. These simple considerations have consequences. First, it's a category mistake to ascribe psychological attributes to the brain. The brain is not a possible subject of psychological predicates. It makes no more sense to ascribe thinking, believing, sensing or perceiving, feeling, wanting and deciding to the brain than it would be to ascribe them to the heart. It's not false that the brain thinks and reasons. It makes no sense to ascribe thought and rationality to the brain. It's not false that the brain sees and hears, feels pain and sorrow. It's nonsense, not rubbish, but rather a transgression of the bounds of sense. The brain is not the kind of object to which psychological predicates in general and intellectual and volitional predicates in particular can be ascribed. Why not? Because such predicates are ascribed to an animal, a living being, on the grounds of its behavior in the circumstances of life. That is partly constitutive of the meaning of such psychological predicates. They're also self-ascribed by a language-using being without any grounds whatsoever. But such a being can intelligibly do so if and only if it has mastered the criterial application of such predicates to others on the grounds of behavior. Brains cannot be said to think, be thoughtful or thoughtless, to act with or without thought, to think before they act or act before they think. And it's obvious why. Brains don't behave, nor do they act or take action. They do not thoughtfully inquire after the health of an acquaintance, nor do they thoughtlessly drop clangers. The brain is not an agent of human action. Secondly, the ascription of psychological attributes to the brain involves a logical fallacy. It's perfectly correct that we would have no intellectual and volitional powers unless we had appropriately functioning brains. Nor would we be able to walk or talk without appropriately functioning brains. But it doesn't follow that we walk and talk with our brain. To ascribe cognitive attributes to the brain is to commit what Max Bennett and I have elsewhere called a mereological fallacy. Mereology is the logic of part-whole relationships. It's a mereological fallacy to ascribe properties that essentially belong to a whole to parts of the whole. For example, although an antique table clock will not keep time without a fusee, it's not the fusee but the clock that keeps time. Similarly, an aeroplane can't fly if its engines aren't working. Nevertheless, it's not the engines that fly, it's the aeroplane. It is a comparable mereological fallacy to ascribe psychological predicates to the brain. We would have no faculties without a brain, and we wouldn't exercise our intellectual and volitional powers without an appropriately functioning brain. Nevertheless, it's the human being, not the brain, that thinks and reasons, that perceives and feels. Thirdly, the suggestion that we are our brains makes no sense. We are human beings, and human beings, like all animals, have brains. How can a human being be identical with something he has? We're substances, living organisms of a kind. How can a living substance be identical with one of its parts? If I'm identical with my brain, then I'm only 7 inches tall, and I weigh only 3 pounds. In short, all my apparent somatic attributes are illusory. They're not actually my attributes at all, but only attributes of the vehicle in which I'm embodied, namely my body. But this makes no sense at all, for my brain doesn't have a body. It's part of a body, namely the human organism. But surely, one might object, the brain is a limiting case of a mutilated human being. We can imagine losing our limbs, but still remaining the same person. Indeed, the same human being, terribly mutilated. We can, ghoulishly, imagining losing our whole body, leaving only a head appropriately sustained by oxygenated blood and food drips, I suppose. Can't we imagine removing the brain from the skull of Mr. A and preserving it? Would not the brain then be Mr. A? So does the person not continue to live and think? And if we make a vat for the brain and wire it up in appropriate ways, may it not tell us what it thinks and remembers? And if we give it prosthetic sense organs, maybe even a prosthetic body, would this being, who seems to have all the memories of Mr. A, actually be Mr. A? No. Here we've let our imagination run away with us, as we do when we tell tales of time travel, like H.G. Wells, or of exchanging bodies, like Anstey. But imaginability is not a criterion of logical possibility. A decerebrated human body is a corpse, but a brain in a jar is not a corpse. A brain kept alive in a jar is not a living human being. If we suppose that we could insert this brain into a prosthetic body, and that the body then spoke, rehearsing the memories of Mr. A, would that not prove that the brain is Mr. A? I think not. It would show that this new synthetic being, what we might call a cerebroid, not a human being, could rehearse Mr. A's memories in its utterances. Would this not count as a transmutation of Mr. A? I think not, but one thing does seem to me to be quite clear. This is not a matter of philosophical insight into deep verities, it's a matter of decision. Fortunately, we're not called upon to make it. But if we were, the most relevant considerations wouldn't be so-called metaphysics. It would rather depend on Mrs. A and the children, on material and property rights, and so forth. In short, a brain is not a special kind of human being, or a human being in a special kind of state, nor is a brain a person. For a person is a language-using creature with intellect and will, knowledge of good and evil, responsible for its deeds and the bearer of rights and duties. Brains aren't creatures, but parts of creatures. They're not language users, although possession of an appropriate kind of well-functioning brain is a sine qua non for being a language-using creature. They aren't subjects of psychological attributes, they perform no actions, and they aren't responsible for anything at all. It might well be argued that even if it was conceptually confused to suppose that we're identical with our minds, and that our minds are the agents of thought, affection, and volition, this wasn't particularly harmful. So what harm could there be in the supposition that we're identical with our brains, and that our brains are the real agents of thought, affection, and the will? The harms consequent upon such conceptual confusions are, I think, of 5 different kinds. First, the allure of the computer analogy and the mesmerizing character of the flow of debatable discoveries from fMRI research has induced widespread conceptual confusion. This seems to me to be an irresponsible imposition of pseudo-scientific mythology upon a gullible, educated and semi-educated public who deserve better from the intellectual elite of their society. Secondly, brain-body dualism produces misconceived explanations of phenomena neuroscience and psychology endeavor to explain. Let me briefly cite a few examples. Sperry and Gazzaniga offer an explanation of striking forms of functional dissociation displayed by patients who've undergone hemispherectomy. They explain the dissociation by the hypothesis that one hemisphere of the brain can't communicate what it sees and knows to the other, so the other hemisphere confabulates an alternative explanation. Now, this makes no sense, for neither brains nor brain hemispheres can either see or know, interpret or confabulate anything. What looks like and is presented as an explanation is no more than a description of the phenomena in the colourful terms of a Walt Disney cartoon. Second example, eminent neuroscientists explain perception in terms of the generation of images of the outside world in the brain. Crick observes that what the brain learns is usually about the outside world. This is why what we see appears to be located outside us, although the neurons that do the seeing are inside the head. Chris Frith holds that even if all our senses are intact and our brain is functioning normally, we don't have direct access to the physical world. It may feel as if we had direct access, but this is an illusion created by our brain. And Kandel and Wurtz query, how is information carried by separate pathways brought together into a coherent visual image? How does the brain construct a perceived world from sensory information, and how does it bring it into consciousness? Now, this is to repeat the errors of 17th century philosophers and scientists, such as Galileo, Descartes, Boyle, and Locke. As long as we cleave to the representative theory of perception, we cannot hope to arrive at a satisfactory empirical account of perception. What we perceive are not images in the mind, nor images created by the brain, but objects, events, processes, colours, sounds, and smells in the world around us. If conceptual howlers underpin empirical research, there is no hope of reaching empirical understanding of what puzzles us. Third example, Libet, followed by Frith, Haggard, and others, has argued that voluntary action is initiated by the brain before the person even knows what he's about to do. The motor centers of the brain are active 350 milliseconds prior to the agent's feeling a desire or intention to move, and 500 milliseconds before the relevant muscles begin to contract. It is suggested that the only window of opportunity for a human being to stop his brain from mischief is 150 milliseconds before his muscles contract. That is all that free will amounts to. Now this, it seems to me, is straight out of Alice Through the Looking Glass, and it is truly amazing that it's taken seriously rather than as a joke. Again, those who are unfamiliar with the errors and follies of history are fated to repeat them. The conception of voluntary action underpinning this research is bad 17th century metaphysics. Voluntary action is not action caused by preceding acts of volition. There is no such thing as feeling and intention or decisions. Decisions and intentions are not causes of behavior anyway. And a behavior that is caused by an urge, such as sneezing after taking snuff, is a prototype of non-voluntary behavior. Unless neuroscientists understand what it is to act voluntarily, intentionally, with intent, on purpose, deliberately, they cannot hope to find what neural processes are associated with free action. These three examples suffice to show that serious neuroscientific research is being vitiated by conceptual confusions that invalidate the research, undermine its conclusions, and mislead not only neuroscientists, but also lay members of the interested public. Many other examples could be given of this sorry state of affairs. Thirdly, the results of highly questionable neuroscientific research is beginning to affect serious legal and moral decisions in the public domain. Neuroscientific evidence is being admitted into law courts in the USA and Australia to support pleas of lack of responsibility in murder trials. Now, this is anything but expert witness. In Britain, recent claims made in Cambridge about the alleged consciousness of patients in a permanent vegetative state were immediately interpreted as having direct practical bearing on whether such patients should be kept alive. But it is very doubtful whether the evidence supports the claim that such patients are conscious. In short, we need to be a little more angelic and tread more fearfully. Fourthly, it's not a trivial matter that such vast sums of public money are being spent on highly questionable fMRI research programs. we should at the very least be clearer about what fMRI can show us about brain functions before we endorse such massive expenditure. Finally, what may be the most important of all the harmful consequences is also the most intangible. These conceptual confusions foster a pernicious conception of humanity, of human relations, of human activity, and of human creativity. Members of the scientific community, aided and abetted by neuropsychologists and neurophilosophers, by neurolawyers and neuroeconomists, are reshaping our conception of ourselves, our understanding of ourselves, and of our culture. Richard Dawkins tells us that, I quote, each one of us is a machine, like an airline, only much more complicated. Colin Blakemore agrees. We are machines, but machines so wonderfully designed that no one should count it an insult to be called such a machine, unquote. But we're not machines. We're living human beings, rational creatures with goals and purposes of our own, moral agents answerable for our deeds, bearers of rights and duties, and so persons. Machines are neither rational nor irrational. Machines do not pursue their own goals, and they have no purposes of their own. They are not moral agents, and they aren't responsible for what they do. Machines do not have rights and duties, and they deserve no formal respect that is due to autonomous rational beings. How we think of ourselves, what conception we have of human nature, partly determines what kinds of things we do and how we lead our lives. No one, I trust, will suppose that the conception the medievals had of themselves as possessing immortal souls, as destined for reward or punishment in an afterlife, as morally subject to the Vicar of Christ on earth, did not affect the way they lived, what they did, and what they thought worthy. Rivers of blood flowed as a consequence of such beliefs. If we think of ourselves as machines, as biological computers, as determined by our brains, if we think of our sense of justice and fairness as the blind product of evolution rather than the product of reason and reasonableness, if we think of our aesthetic sense and judgment as the product of our brain's responsiveness to hourglass shapes of women's waists, this too will affect the way we live, what we do, and what we think of as worthy. The prospect, I find, is deeply disturbing. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ray and Peter, for those extremely interesting and, as you gathered, very tentative explorations of the theme that lies before us. Are there any brains in the room that want to protest on their own behalf? If you could ask questions focused on either Ray Tallis or Peter Hacker, it would be great, and keep them short. So the gentleman here, thank you. There is a microphone.
Thank you for this talk. I have one question for Raymond Tallis and one for Peter Hacker. So you, Mr. Tallis, said that this is not, the identification with the brain is not really a new idea, and you cited some old material, but couldn't you say that at least in this time it was more a minority position? If you look at Homer, Plato, Aristotle, and some others, they all believe that the heart is the seat of the soul. So that may distinguish our times from those times. And the second question for Peter Hacker, you, I think 2 or 3 times used the term we are embodied in our embodied minds and then embodied brains. And there is another strand in philosophy of mind and cognitive science that use embodiment kind of in a different sense. So, for example, Sean Gallagher or Alva Noé, who are also critical about persons being their brains, or you are your brain, but they say that embodiment is something like the interaction of an organism with its environment. And that seems to be a different concept of embodiment than you used it, where your concept was more like the old idea that something is just incarnated in something else. But this is not the same concept of embodiment. So I wanted to ask you what you think of this literature, of this view of embodiment.
Thank you. Ray.
Can you hear me all right? Or
I hear you.
speaking near the microphone? Fine, thank you. I mean, you're quite right. There have been many strands historically identifying other organs with the mind, and Aristotle famously thought the heart was associated with the soul, and the brain's job was just to cool it, basically. And then there's a long tradition in which you can look at different parts of the brain being associated with the soul or the mind, and that is a pretty strong thread. But your point is absolutely right. I don't know how seriously these things were taken, but now they are being taken seriously in precisely the worrying way that Peter is speaking. You know, they've now spread out from academe, from the philosophers, into popular discourse, and having really serious consequences in the way we think about economic behavior, about the law, about art, etc., etc. I mean, all these neuro-prefixed bollocks that is completely, present throughout public discourse it's getting a hold, and it's getting a hold because it thinks it has something very glamorous behind it, robust evidence, which again Peter's shown that actually that's not at all the case. So it's perhaps more important now than it has been.
I was a little unclear at this novel notion of embodiment that you say is around, because if embodiment means, you said, I think, the interaction of the organism with its environment, I can't see any connection between organisms interacting with their environment and the term embodiment. I just don't see the connection. I mean, you can call it what you like, but it doesn't seem to have anything much to do with the notion of being embodied. Now, my own view is that we're not an embodied mind and we're not an embodied brain either. I rather like the Aristotelian version of the story, so to speak, here, namely we're ensouled. That is, the organism has a set of capacities, and that seems to be the truth of the matter.
Right, some more questions. Gentleman at the front here. Perhaps you could say who you are. I should have asked you to.
Yes, I'd like to make some brief comment, and ask some question to Professor Hacker. You have criticized neuropsychology, psychology, neuroscientists, neurophilosophers. All they are wrong. And you say that it's difficult to understand person, mind, analyzing brain. I agree with you that it's not sufficient. But I didn't understand you. What is your proposal? That is the proposal of the goal of this meeting or many other meetings. You talk about mind, brain, person, the concept of I, but you didn't define anything of this concept. You say that the brain and mind are not computer. Nobody believes that we are computer. You said that we are not, brain is not information processing. So I'm asking you, what does the brain when we have, for example, visual perception, in which we elaborate information from outside? So you made many other statements that I didn't understand, which is the goal of your paper, because I think that neuroscientists, neuropsychology are very useful to understand mind. But this is my opinion, but I'm asking you, because I'm here to hear other proposal, and what you propose to analyze brain, to analyze mind, to analyze person. I think that, and the last question is, according to you, there is a role of the brain to be a person, to be a human being, or there is no role, or brain does not have any role to make us as a person and to have a mind. I'm asking you your position.
Well,
what is the role of the brain, if there is a role of the brain, or there is no role of the brain?
I think, I think you must have misunderstood what I was at least trying to do. Perhaps I've done it very unsuccessfully. Neuroscience is a very wonderful subject, and we've discovered more about the workings of the brain in the last 50 years than in the whole history of humanity. And with good fortune, we'll discover a great deal more, which will be very beneficial. With luck, within the next few decades, neuroscientists will find cures for Parkinson's, they will find ways of treating dementia and Alzheimer's, and that's truly wonderful. I have no qualms about the usefulness and importance and the excitement of neuroscience. All I'm trying to do, since I am a philosopher, is to draw attention to conceptual confusions. And what I've suggested in my paper is that there are multitudinous conceptual confusions that are rife in current neuroscientific discussion, let alone rife in bogus sciences like neuroeconomics or neurolaw and other neuroaesthetics and other bits of, crudely speaking, nonsense. Now, you said, what is the role of the brain? Well, you know as well as I what the role, I'm sure you know as well as I what is the role of the brain. No one's disputing that we can do anything without the brain. No one is disputing that we are identifying parts of the brain which are causally implicated in a wide range of human functions. That's not the issue. The issues that I've raised are issues that are purely conceptual. They are confusions that turn on ascribing psychological predicates to parts of the brain, which makes no sense. They are explanations, or what look like explanations, e.g. the Sperry-Gazzaniga explanation of the dissociative functions consequent upon hemispherectomy. They look like explanations. They're actually not explanations at all. They merely re-describe the problems in highly colourful speculative terms that actually make no sense. Very often, evidence that is discovered is being put forward as evidence for theses that actually don't make sense at all. So the only role I can see for a philosopher is a conceptual critic, to tell neuroscientists to slow down and think a little bit harder, put a little more thought into their experiments. I picked out 2 or 3 themes where neuroscientists are sunk not in 21st century neuroscience or 20th century philosophy, 21st century philosophy, but in bad 17th century metaphysics. If you're going to investigate the different ways in which the brain and parts of the brain may be implicated in voluntary behavior or intentional behavior or behavior consequent upon decisions, you'd better be clear about the concepts of voluntariness, intentionality, doing something with intent, doing something on purpose, deciding to do something, and so on and so forth. And people like Benjamin Libet or Chris Frith are not. If you're going to understand the very complex procedures that are involved in perception, of which we're beginning to scratch the surface, and that's about all so far. It's a great achievement to scratch the surface, but it's still all we've done. But if you're going to do that, you'd better not be sunk in 17th century causal theories of representation, because they're conceptually incoherent.
Yes, I think Ray would like to chip in here.
I feel in many ways I'm a co-defendant here. And I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the sort of thing I think Peter and I share is what Locke says. You know, he was just a humble undergardener clearing the rubbish that lay on the path to truth. And it's important to do that for the sort of reasons that Peter's made clear. Most of my research is in clinical neuroscience, stroke, epilepsy, and so on. And we've made great progress. I personally wasn't very successful, but the science made great progress. And so what are the jobs? The first is a deeper and deeper understanding of how the brain works as a necessary condition for all of those faculties that Peter talked about. And also to understand how it recovers from damage. So rehabilitation is a very important area. But then we need to think again about the relationship between the brain as a necessary condition for all of these faculties, and what amounts to a sufficient condition of those faculties. What is the gap between brain function and the function of a person? We need to look at that more clearly. And I think there's another issue, which is at what point does metaphysics kick in? I think one of the problems is a lot of neuroscientists, not the majority, probably, the feel that a lot of what they do has metaphysical implications, such as understanding free will, understanding the nature of consciousness, and so on. But clearly there is an interesting metaphysical inquiry to be pursued, and we need to think about how that may or may not relate to brain science. The problem at the moment is prematurely brain science, both at the empirical level and the conceptual level, is, as it were, or some scientists making claims that get in the way of our really, really thinking in an interesting way about things.
There's a question at the back.
Can I speak loudly and be heard?
Yes, and the microphone is coming, which will make it even more loud.
Stuart Judge, retired neuroscientist. I think it would be helpful if we could take a not too simple piece of data from neuroscience. Both our speakers have said very clearly that they're not dismissive of neuroscience itself, and consider how differently the results would be described depending on whether one follows philosophical moves that our philosophical experts are happy with and not. So that the example that occurs to me is the one, I think it's Damasio's group, about lesions in the frontal cortex in an unfortunate position having a tendency to shift responses in a sort of moral conundrum problem in a what you might call utilitarian direction. You know, you do heave the dead man out of the boat that's floundering. Now, there are technical problems with the study, but what would be an appropriate and inappropriate way of describing the significance or lack of it of a result like that?
Now, who would like to respond to that, Ray?
I can make an initial response. I mean, the frontal lobe's a good one, because you think all our interest in the frontal lobes began with Phineas Gage, I guess, a famous patient in the 19th century who unfortunately got an iron rod through the front of his brain and somehow survived, and he's said to have had a total personality change, although other functions such as ability to walk and talk and to see and so on were preserved. And that really was the grandfather of all sorts of observations about what was thought to be the distinctive localized role of the frontal lobes. Basically, the locus of a sense of responsibility, of deferred gratification, of thinking ahead, and so on and so forth. And I think we need to look at those things. We need to look again at, for example, our interpretation of frontal lobe damage and say, well, we know the frontal lobe by itself doesn't take responsibility, doesn't have executive function. We know that, I mean, for all the reasons that Peter said. So how are we really going to interpret what is happening without falling into this trap of personifying bits of the brain? And so I think there's a bit of work to be done, and part of that work, in order to be done, we have to stop doing the wrong thing. Clearing the decks.
There's plenty more questions. We've got time for perhaps two if you're quick. There are two next to each other up there. Can you fight it out between you as to which is the more appropriate?
I'll ask the microphone if that's okay.
Yeah.
This question is for Dr. Tallis. You argue that consciousness isn't a material thing. I've been... Okay, I'll use this. I've been convinced by people like David Chalmers that you're right. Let me agree with you on that. What I wanted to ask you is how exactly this is going to support a non-physical view of personhood. Just to draw this distinction between consciousness and personhood, take what happens to us every night when we go to sleep. We lose consciousness, but we remain persons. We can be truly described as having character traits and character dispositions and being honest and intelligent and liking whiskey too much and whatever else. Maybe there is some important relation between consciousness and personhood, but I didn't see that in your talk you laid it out so that a non-physical view of consciousness would imply a non-physical view of personhood. So if you could spell out exactly what the relation is so that I could see how that implication goes forward, that would be good. Thank you.
Certainly, no problem at all. If you were, no, seriously, very straightforward. If you were never conscious, you couldn't be a person. Just because you have intermissions of consciousness doesn't mean to say that that you can be a person without being conscious. Is that okay?
It has to be okay, because otherwise no other questions can be asked.
wanted to get clear to a point about the relation between person and substance. So you started by saying a person is not a substance concept, but a status concept. And then when you were going through your analysis of mind, you said, of course, the powers of the abilities which we can, in a sense, reduce mind to or replace mind taught by these, must be exercised by a substance or agent, the human being. So that would seem to suggest for you the human being is a substance concept, and you also said we are substances, organisms. But you wanted to say a person is not a substance concept. So you don't understand us being persons and us being human beings as the same kind of claim, I'm assuming, because those two things are separate. So on the relation between us and our brain, now the relation gets somewhat complicated depending on whether we're us as persons or us as human beings, particularly, for instance, in the mereological fallacy, because you couldn't have a mereological fallacy with persons, because person is not a substance concept. But human being, you could have a mereological fallacy because human being is a substance concept, so it can have parts. So if you could just clarify that for me, I'd be very grateful.
Yes.
I wanted to ask this question too. So.
Yeah, yes, I'll try to do so. The issue of the relationship between the mereology of human beings and the fact that we feel pretty uncomfortable with saying off the cuff that persons have parts is, I think, an interesting one. It was raised by John Searle in the debate Max Bennett and I had with Searle and Dennett in New York, and has been raised by my friend Rom Harry in the current issue of philosophy, to which I've already replied. I do think that human beings are a species, a kind, Homo sapiens, a certain sort of animal. And the concept of a human being shares logical features with all other substance concepts, in particular ones that apply to living things. The concept of a person seems to me simply a status concept. It's a legal and moral one, and it's a legal and moral one for which a substance qualifies if it meets a certain array of conditions, particularly, but not only, rationality. Now, therefore, of course, all persons are substances. That's obvious. But that doesn't make the concept of a person a substance concept. I do think that, at least in theory, or if you like speculatively, there could be other kinds of persons in the living in the biological realm. It's not, as it were, that we are the only kind of person there could be is a human kind. That seems to me absolutely wrong, although I think it's probably true that the only actual kind of person on this globe, at any rate, are human beings, not any of the other animals. They lack the faculties. I think it's correct to say that the brain, it would be very odd to say that the brain is a part of a person. The brain's part of a human being. I used the analogy when I replied to John Searle. London is part of the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom is part of the European Union. London isn't part of the European Union. The European Union is a certain political and economic organization. Britain isn't, although it is also an economic organization, it isn't. It's a nation state with a certain geographical locus. So the clash, where there is a clash here, is of different kinds of categories. And I think a disinclination to say that that the concept of a person can be, as it were, broken down into person parts, stems from a sense that we're dealing with the wrong kind of category. But it is interesting. And of course, we say Jack is a person, and Jack's brain is certainly part of Jack. We also feel less reluctance here when we're talking about people as opposed to persons. So you're in a rather grey area where different categorical concepts meet and to some extent mingle.
That was a very interesting response. I think I'm going to have to end there just with one remark, namely to refer you to Boethius' definition of a person as an individual substance of a rational nature, which seems to cross your two categories rather in a threatening way. That's a very good beginning to our conference, I hope you all agree. We're all excited by the mildness and tentativeness of our presentation.
If you make your way outside through the rain, you'll find a drinks reception in the marquee on the lawn.